feel that? It's the weight of 7 years of silence. A brilliant philosopher vanishes, and the world calls it a choice. His only student calls it a crime. Was it a retreat into peace? Or was he sealed in a tomb of silence built by his greatest rival? Stay with me, because the truth is more terrifying than the mystery. Some mysteries don't begin with a scream. They begin with a silence so profound, the world mistakes it for peace. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, because today we are uncovering a story they tried to bury in quiet reverence. For 7 years, the world believed that Dr. Julian Croft, the most incisive Stoic voice of his generation, had simply chosen to disappear. It was the perfect ending, they said. The ultimate philosophical act from a man who taught that the greatest fortress was the quiet of one's own mind. His final published essay, titled The Architect of Silence, was not read as a work of philosophy, but as a farewell letter, a blueprint for his own vanishing. There was no missing persons report, no bolo alert issued for a man with a quiet gaze and a mind that could dismantle fear. The academic community, the very world he had shaped, treated his disappearance with a kind of solemn respect. He had simply walked off the map, they concluded, into the vast, untroubled landscape of his own teachings. The case was never opened. It was never even a case. It was lore. But for one person, the silence was never peaceful. For Elara Vance, his former and only protégé, it was a scream she had been hearing for 2,555 days. While the world moved on, she kept vigil. While the news cycles churned and a new, more charismatic philosopher named Marcus Thorne built a glittering empire on the ghost of Croft's teachings, Elara waited. Thorne was everything Croft was not. Polished, media-savvy, he sold Stoicism not as a discipline, but a luxury brand. His Eudaimonia Institute offered weekend retreats and mindfulness apps, promising inner peace for a steep price. He spoke of Croft with the careful sadness of a devoted follower, honoring the master who had chosen a path of absolute solitude. Thorne's success was built on the foundation of Croft's absence, a monument erected on an empty grave. Elara watched it all, her heart a cold, hard knot of certainty. She knew the man who had mentored her. She knew his philosophy was not about running away. It was about standing your ground, about facing the world with an unbreakable inner resolve. It was not about building a sanctuary to hide in. It was about becoming the sanctuary itself. Every day, the world's quiet acceptance felt like a new layer of earth being shoveled onto the truth. And every day, Elara was haunted by the question that had become the foundation of her life, the one she would whisper into the darkness of her small apartment. What if Julian Croft didn't build his silence? What if it was built for him, around him, like the cold final walls of a tomb? Before he was a ghost, a myth whispered in university halls, he was just a man, my mentor. And to understand what was taken, you have to understand what he was. The world remembers his words, but I remember his presence. He taught that the mind must be a fortress, an inner citadel that no external chaos could breach. His was made of quiet intensity, built on a foundation of worn leather bindings and the scent of old paper that clung to his study in the Hudson Valley. The sun would cut through the tall, wavy glass of his windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny, silent stars. That was his world. He was not a performer. His lectures, often just to me across a heavy oak desk, were acts of careful dismantlement. He would take a fear, the fear of loss, of failure, of death, and gently unbolt it, piece by piece, until all that was left was a set of harmless components you could examine without terror. And then there was his laugh. It was a rare, quiet, booming sound that seemed to start deep in his chest and roll outwards as if shaking the dust from ideas that had sat silent for centuries. He believed philosophy was a tool for living, not a product for selling. He despised what he called the philosophical marketplaces of modern media. That is where the first crack appeared. I remember the day Marcus Thorne came to the house. He was a promising student then, with a smile that was too bright and an ambition that burned cold. He arrived not with a question, but with a proposal, a business plan. He spread glossy printouts on the oak desk, charts and projections detailing a plan to package stoicism for the masses, an app, a subscription model, celebrity endorsements. I watched Julian's face. There was no anger, only a profound and heavy sadness. He picked up one of the pages, a mock-up of an advertisement featuring a serene-looking model. He looked at Marcus, his gaze steady. "You don't sell peace of mind, Marcus," he said, and his voice was gentle, which made the words cut deeper. "You build it, stone by stone, within yourself. What you are selling is a picture of a fortress, not the fortress itself." Marcus's smile tightened just for a second. The ambition in his eyes flickered, becoming something harder, resentment. "People need guidance, Julian," he argued. "They need an accessible path." "A path, yes," Julian replied, placing the paper back on the desk as if it were contaminated. "Not a toll road." That was the moment. That was the schism. I didn't know it then, but I was witnessing the birth of a motive. I was watching a man who was offered a key to the citadel choose instead to draw up blueprints for a counterfeit, deciding that if he couldn't own the real thing, he would simply build an empire on its stolen image. And if the original architect stood in the way, well, architects can be silenced. After Julian vanished, my fight was against an enemy I couldn't see. For 7 years, the world was a thick, gray fog. I wrote letters to academic journals, my arguments sharp and precise, pointing out the deliberate and subtle ways Marcus Thorne was twisting Julian's work into something unrecognizable. I presented papers at minor conferences, my voice shaking in quiet rooms, trying to warn his old colleagues that the narrative they had accepted, the story of a peaceful retreat, was a carefully constructed lie. The response was always the same: a polite, patronizing dismissal, a soft, pitying smile. To them, I was the spurned student, unable to let go. A woman clinging to the ghost of an old master who had simply grown tired of the world and moved on. Marcus Thorne, with his polished media appearances and his roster of celebrity endorsements, was the dynamic future. Julian Croft, the man who cared more for truth than for influence, was the past. They didn't see a crime. They saw an orderly succession. And I, with my frantic warnings, was just noise disrupting the calm. Those were the cold years. The fog settled into my bones. By day, I was a university archivist, a quiet custodian of other people's histories, my hands smelling of decaying paper and preservation chemicals. But my real work began after hours in a small apartment that had become less a home and more a cold case file. One entire wall was a shrine to his memory and my obsession. A corkboard crowded with maps of the Hudson Valley, timelines of his last known weeks, and passages from his works, all interconnected with a web of red string. It was my wall of evidence for a crime no one believed had happened. Every lead I pursued dissolved upon approach. Every question I asked was met with a hollow, echoing silence. The not knowing became a form of psychological torture, a slow and patient erosion of the soul. The world saw a mystery, a romantic tale of a philosopher's final act. I saw a void, an erasure. Every potential answer was like a knife made of fog. I could feel its presence, a sharp and chilling pressure against my skin. But whenever I reached out to grab it, to expose it to the light, my hand closed on nothing but cold, empty air. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound. It was an active, suffocating force, and I was alone in it. Hope doesn't always arrive like a thunderclap. Sometimes it's just a whisper. After 7 years of shouting into the void, the first echo back came in the form of an automated email from a small, obscure auction house in rural Vermont. My fingers trembled as I read the listing. Item 34B, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, First American edition, 1864. Contains extensive handwritten annotations. An interesting piece for a collector, nothing more. But it was the line below, the one detailing the book's provenance, that made the air leave my lungs. From the private collection of Dr. J. Croft. It shouldn't exist. The book was an impossibility. After his disappearance, Julian's entire library, every volume he had ever treasured, was meticulously cataloged and donated to his university. I knew because I had overseen the process myself. Each book a painful reminder of the man who was gone. This one, it seemed, had slipped through the cracks. It was the accidental breakthrough. The one loose thread that could unravel everything. I drained my savings account, my heart pounding with a frantic, desperate rhythm as I sat through the online auction, outbidding a handful of oblivious collectors. For them, it was a rare book. For me, it was everything. When the small cardboard package finally arrived, I handled it with the reverence of a priestess touching a holy relic. The leather was cracked and worn, the pages smelling of time and dust, and something else I couldn't name. Hope, maybe. The annotations were dense, his familiar, sharp handwriting filling every margin in dark ink. At first, they appeared to be standard philosophical reflections, his quiet dialogue with the Roman emperor across the centuries. But then I saw it. A detail no one else in the world would have noticed. A detail meant only for me. A coded system. Markings, tiny, precise dots above certain words, faint brackets around specific phrases, and nearly invisible underscores beneath select letters. It was a system he had taught me years ago, a private language for embedding a secondary, hidden message within a text. My breath hitched. My world, which had been gray and foggy for so long, suddenly snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. This book wasn't just his thoughts on Marcus Aurelius. This was a message from a ghost. This was a map. And for the first time in 7 years, I knew exactly where I had to go. The book was a guide, a final, desperate lesson from my mentor. The first clue was hidden not in the writings of Marcus Aurelius, but in a commentary on a letter by Seneca. Next to a passage about preparing for one's final days, Julian had written, in his sharp, familiar script, "The sage does not fear the end, he prepares for its location." Beneath it, a series of faintly underlined words, when read in sequence, spelled out a single, chilling phrase: Blackwater County. The name meant nothing to me. A quick search revealed a sparsely populated county in the northernmost reaches of Maine, a place of dense pine forests and forgotten towns, known more for logging than for philosophy. But it was Julian's own annotation that held me. For a Stoic, memento mori, remember you must die, is a call to live a virtuous and examined life. It is a tool for perspective. But here, twisted and coded in the margins of this book, it felt different. It was not a philosophical meditation. It was a warning. I realized then that the entire book was a roadmap, constructed from the very ideas he had taught me. My skills as an archivist, once used to catalog the histories of others, were now deployed in a far more dangerous game, deciphering the last will and testament of a man who might still be alive. The work was painstaking. My apartment illuminated by a single desk lamp into the small, quiet hours of the morning. Each philosophical concept was a signpost. A discussion on the premeditation of evils wasn't just a lesson on preparing the mind for hardship. The specific words he had bracketed pointed to a single township within Blackwater County. A scribbled note on voluntary exile, a Stoic practice of retreating from the world to gain clarity, corresponded with an abandoned logging road on an old surveyor's map. The dots he placed over certain words were not random. They were GPS coordinates. The philosophy wasn't the motive for his disappearance. It was the key to uncovering it. He had taken the abstract architecture of his life's work and transformed it into a physical, tangible path, a breadcrumb trail of ancient wisdom meant for an audience of one. The irony was devastating. He had used the very tools designed to build an inner fortress of peace to map the coordinates of his own potential tomb. And I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and clarifying, that I had to follow it. The pines of Blackwater County rose on either side of the narrow two-lane road like patient sentinels. They guarded a silence that felt ancient and absolute, a place where the modern world's frantic noise simply ceased to exist. This was a land that had been forgotten by progress, a landscape where memories could vanish quietly and without protest. Following the cryptic coordinates from Julian's book, my rental car kicking up a cloud of dust, I found myself on a derelict property miles down an unmarked road. A rusted, bullet-pocked sign hung crookedly from a single hinge. It read, Briarwood Institute. The buildings were little more than skeletal remains being slowly swallowed by the forest. Roofs had collapsed, windows were dark, hollow eyes, and nature was patiently reclaiming what it had lost. According to Julian's notes, this was a place of indifferent things. That's a Stoic concept for externals that are neither good nor bad, things outside our control, like wealth, reputation, or decay. The abandoned institute, left to the whims of time and weather, was the perfect, haunting manifestation of the idea. As I stepped into the decaying main hall, my heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Dust floated in the sunbeams like snow caught in a photograph. A rising dread prickled my skin. This place was not chosen at random. It was too deliberate, too perfect. I found it set back from the main buildings, almost hidden by a clutch of overgrown birch trees. A small groundskeeper's cottage. Unlike the other structures, it was intact. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open, and the air that hit me was cold and still. But it was clean. Too clean. There was no dust here. No sign of the decay that consumed everything else. Someone had been here recently. My hand hovered over my phone, the urge to call the police a screaming instinct. But who would I call? And what would I say? My gaze fell upon a simple wooden desk pushed against the far wall. On it sat a single object. A piece of technology so starkly out of place among the rot and ruin that it felt like a hallucination. It was a modern, slim laptop computer, closed, its metallic surface gleaming in the dim light. My blood ran cold. This was no ruin. This was no philosopher's retreat. This was a trap. And I had just walked into it. My hand shook as I reached for the laptop. It wasn't password protected. The screen glowed to life, the bright, sterile light a violation in the dim cottage. There was a single folder on the desktop, titled with one word, Providence. I clicked. Inside was a collection of journal files dated over a period of 3 months, 7 years ago. They were written by Julian Croft. The truth I had hunted for so long was finally here, and it was so much worse than anything I had ever imagined. The journal was a harrowing person account of his imprisonment at the Briarwood Institute. He was not in exile. He was a captive. The words on the screen blurred through my tears as I read his account of the abduction, orchestrated by Marcus Thorne himself. Thorne had brought him to this remote prison with one goal: to force Julian to sign over the intellectual rights to his entire life's work, to legally become the ghost on which Thorne's empire was built. But the journal was more than a record of a crime. It was a testament to the very philosophy he lived. In page after page, Julian wrote obsessively about the dichotomy of control, the core Stoic principle of separating what we can control from what we cannot. He could not control his captivity, the walls of his prison, or the malice of his former student. But he could control his response. He could control his mind. He wrote about how he secretly began creating the annotated meditations, A message in a bottle cast into the sea of time. A final lesson for the one person he knew would understand its language. My name appeared on the last page, and my heart stopped. "He thinks he has built my cage," the entry read, "but my mind is a place he cannot touch. I can only control this final message and trust it to you, Elara. You know what to do." As my eyes scanned that last desperate sentence, a sound from the present shattered the past. A heavy, metallic click from behind me. I spun around. The cottage door, the one I had left ajar, was now shut, and the deadbolt had been thrown from the outside. The silence of the forest rushed in, no longer peaceful, but predatory. The trap hadn't just been set for him. It had been waiting for me. Panic is a choice. The thought was so clear in the cold, silent room, it felt as if Julian himself had whispered it in my ear. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but his voice, his teaching, was the counter-rhythm. Trapped. I was trapped. But my reaction to that fact was still mine. I fought back the rising tide of terror by clinging to the philosophy he had hammered into my soul. I remembered one of his favorite maxims, a quote from Marcus Aurelius that he had made me write out 100 times. "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." The obstacle was my prison. Therefore, my prison had to be the way out. I forced myself to breathe, to slow my heart, to see the room not as a captive, but as a philosopher solving a problem. My gaze fell back to the laptop, to Julian's journal. I started reading it again, not for the story, but for the clues. I realized it wasn't just a confession. It was an instruction manual. He had anticipated this. He had anticipated me. A seemingly random complaint in one entry about a loose floorboard near the hearth was not a complaint. It was a signpost. A philosophical musing on the intricate nature of cause and effect was not an abstract thought. It was a hint that pointed me toward a strange, out-of-place lever hidden deep inside the fireplace flue. He knew he might not escape, so he had turned his own prison into a final harrowing test for his protégé, a physical manifestation of his teachings. He had left a hidden escape route, a path that could only be found by someone who could think like a Stoic. The process was painstaking. My hands, slick with sweat and covered in soot, fumbled with the mechanism in the fireplace. My nails chipped and broke as I pried at the floorboard. Every creak of the old cottage, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through me. It was a terrifying race against the clock, a desperate gamble before Thorne or his agents returned to find their trap sprung. He had left me a path, but I had to have the courage and the clarity of mind to walk it. Beneath the loose floorboard Julian's journal had pointed to, my fingers found not a key, but the cold, hard plastic of a small, sealed box. Inside was the true treasure, the real evidence. It was a set of microcassette tapes and a small, outdated recorder. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely thread the first tape into the machine. I pressed play. Hiss. Static. Then a voice. Marcus Thorne's. It was smooth, persuasive, the voice the world knew from his podcasts and interviews. He was trying to break Julian, to make him sign a legal document that would transfer his entire legacy, his name, his life's work, to the Eudaimonia Institute. Then, Julian's voice, strained and raspy, but unwavering. He refused. Thorne's voice turned menacing, the velvet stripped away to reveal the cold steel beneath. The most chilling part, the detail that will haunt me for the rest of my life, was Julian's recurring whisper of a single two-word phrase: Amor fati. Love your fate. He wasn't just saying it. He was living it right there in that dark room. He was accepting his fate, imprisonment, coercion, even the threat of death, rather than betraying his principles, rather than letting his philosophy be turned a lie. These tapes were the devastating reveal. They were irrefutable proof of Thorne's crimes: kidnapping, coercion, psychological torture. They were also the ultimate testament to Julian's philosophy, a final, brutal lesson recorded for posterity. As I sat there on the dusty floor, listening to the sounds of my mentor's unbreakable will, my eyes scanned the dark recess under the floorboards. At the far end, I saw it. The wood had been dug away, revealing a dark, narrow opening, an escape tunnel. He had made it out. Julian Croft had escaped his prison. But the tapes, the proof, were still here. He had left them behind. They were too important, too dangerous to risk on his escape. It was a final, desperate act of faith. Faith that I would follow the map he'd laid, that I would uncover this evidence. It was a fate he had accepted for us both, and a burden he had trusted me to carry. Freedom is the first step. Justice is the destination. I emerged from the narrow, damp earth of the tunnel into the cold, gray light of a Maine dawn. The tapes were clutched in my hand, a physical weight that mirrored the burden on my soul. In that moment, I knew I had become the most dangerous person in Marcus Thorne's world. I held the weapon that could not just tarnish, but utterly destroy his billion-dollar empire. And he would know, very soon, that his fortress had been breached. The narrative of my life shifted. The slow, somber burn of a cold case investigator had been extinguished, replaced by the high-gear frequency of a fugitive. I knew Thorne. He wouldn't send uniformed police. He would dispatch a silent, professional manhunt, using the vast, private resources his fortune could buy. They wouldn't be looking to arrest me. They would be looking to erase me. But I was not panicked. I was focused. Julian's lessons, which had guided me through years of grief and months of investigation, were now my primary tactical assets. My inner citadel, once a metaphor for mental resilience, became my shield. I began to think like a hunted animal, but with the dispassionate logic of a stoic. I anticipated Thorne's moves, a grim application of the premeditation of evils. He would track my credit cards, my phone, my rental car. So I abandoned them all. I traveled light, unburdened by non-essentials, a brutal lesson in indifference to externals. A bus ticket bought with cash, a cheap burner phone, a change of clothes from a thrift store. I made decisions based on cold logic, not fear. I was being hunted, but I was also hunting. My target, however, was not a person. It was a platform. I needed a way to get the tapes to the world, to make Julian's voice heard before Thorne's agents could silence me forever. The journey became a tense cat-and-mouse game across the anonymous rural landscapes of New England. Every passing car on a lonely highway, every unfamiliar face in a roadside diner was a potential threat. I was a ghost, moving through the world, carrying the voice of another. And I knew the tyrant's fortress had eyes everywhere. A solitary fight can only go so far. For 7 years, I had been an island, my belief in Julian's peril a truth I held in complete isolation. But now, with the tapes in my possession and a tyrant hunting me, I knew I needed a bridge to the world I had been cut off from. I needed an ally. There was only one name that came to mind: Elias Boone. He was a grizzled, old-school investigative reporter, the kind of journalist who seemed to be a dying breed, a man with a reputation for taking on impossible fights and powerful people. I had contacted him years ago, in the early days of my search. He had listened, shown a brief flicker of professional interest, and then, like everyone else, had politely dismissed me. Now, I had something more than a story. I had proof. From a public library computer, using layers of digital security I had taught myself from paranoid online forums, I sent him a message. The subject line was simple: The Architect of Silence. In the body, I wrote only one sentence: You were right to be skeptical, but you were wrong to dismiss me. Attached was a single 30-second audio clip from the tapes, a short, brutal exchange where Thorne's mask of civility slipped, his voice turning to cold, threatening steel. Hours later, my burner phone vibrated. An encrypted message: Where are you? Don't move. I'm coming. This time, Elias Boone didn't just listen. He believed. Julian often spoke of sympathia, the Stoic concept that all things in the universe are interconnected, woven together in a single vast web. My lonely, isolated struggle was now connected to a larger network. Boone, using resources I couldn't even imagine, moved me from the cheap motel where I was hiding and set me up in a secure, anonymous safe house. For the first time in a week, I could breathe. We began to plan. In the dim light of that safe house, surrounded by Boone's notes and my precious tapes, we became a clandestine two-person army. We detailed a bombshell exposé, a careful strategy to bring down a giant. We couldn't just leak the tapes. Thorne would use his army of lawyers to bury them, to claim they were fakes. We needed a stage, a global platform from which the truth could not be ignored. And we knew the perfect one: Thorne's annual Eudaimonia Summit, a lavish, live-streamed event that was the crown jewel of his fraudulent empire. It was his greatest strength. We were going to make it his gallows. I watched from a crowded bar a few blocks away, my face hidden in the shadows, my eyes fixed on the television screen. Elias was in a network control room miles from the summit, his knuckles white as he held a phone to his ear, listening to my confirmation. On the screen, Marcus Thorne stood on a brilliantly lit stage, a picture of serene, fraudulent authority. He was addressing a stadium of thousands and millions more online, speaking of finding peace, of mastering the self, of building your own inner fortress. The irony was a physical sickness in my stomach. Are you ready? Elias's voice crackled from the burner phone in my hand. I looked at the screen, at the man who had stolen my mentor's life and legacy. Do it. Elias gave a nod to his technician. On the global feed, the image flickered. Thorne's beatific face vanished, replaced by the simple, stark image of a green audio waveform pulsing against a black background. A collective gasp rippled through the stadium audience. Then, silence. And into that silence came a voice. Julian Croft's voice. Clear, resolute, and alive. "You can take my body," the voice from the grave echoed through the arena, through millions of speakers around the world. "You can take my freedom, but you cannot have my consent. You cannot have my will." The audio from the tapes played out, a raw, undeniable record of Thorne's threats and Julian's quiet, unshakable defiance. The slick veneer of the eudaimonious summit was shattered by the brutal, ugly truth of its foundation. The live feed cut back to Thorne's face. The mask of tranquility was gone, shattered into 1,000 pieces. In its place was pure, naked panic. His eyes, wide with terror, darted back and forth as he searched for an escape that wasn't there. His empire of lies, so carefully constructed over 7 years, crumbled in 30 seconds. This was the final confrontation, a public demolition of a carefully crafted falsehood. It was a perfect juxtaposition. Thorne's hollow, commercialized power, which relied on lights and stages and screens, destroyed by the simple, authentic power of Julian's unconquerable will. Justice, I realized, is not always served in a courtroom. Sometimes it's served in the court of public opinion, on the very stage a tyrant built to broadcast his deceit. And the whole world was watching. In the chaotic aftermath, Marcus Thorne was arrested. His institute was dismantled by lawsuits, and Julian Croft was hailed as a martyr and a hero. His name, once a dusty footnote, was on every news channel. The world loves a simple story, and this was the simplest of all. A good man wronged, a villain vanquished, a legacy restored. But I knew the story wasn't that simple. The truth rarely is. There was one last clue in the book, one final annotation I hadn't understood. Next to a passage where Aurelia speaks of the Emperor Antoninus, who loved his country retreat, Julian had scribbled a quiet note on the Roman concept of retirement. To the Sabine Pharma, retreat not from life, but into it. Attached were another set of coordinates, these for a remote, unplottable patch of wilderness deep in the Adirondack Mountains. I drove for 2 days and hiked for 1. I found a small, rustic cabin, smoke curling gently from its stone chimney. And there he was, Julian Croft, alive. He was sitting on the porch, a blanket over his legs, looking out at the vast expanse of mountains. He was frail, his health clearly broken by the long ordeal, but his eyes were as clear and steady as I had ever seen them. He had escaped the cottage shortly before I arrived and had made his way here to this final sanctuary he had prepared long ago. His battle was fought and won. He had chosen to remain in true solitude. Our reunion was not one of tears, but of a quiet, profound understanding that needed no words. He looked at me, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "You did not forget," he said. It was the highest praise he could give. This is a story of justice, but not of victory. It is a story of complex healing. The cost was immense. Julian can never return to his old life, and I am forever changed by the path he set me on. We sat there for a long time, in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep purple. Sometimes, healing doesn't look like a happy ending. Sometimes, it looks like surviving long enough to find your peace again. Home isn't where you were taken from. It's the quiet citadel you build for yourself, wherever you are. And his name and his truth would never be forgotten. I had made sure of that. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the silence. The story of Julian Croft is a testament to the fact that some fortresses can never be conquered, and some truths can never be buried forever. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe a person's ideas can be a weapon, a map, and a sanctuary all at once? Let me know in the comments below. If you believe that no name should stay forgotten, don't forget to subscribe to Unfound and hit the notification bell. We have many more stories to uncover together. Stay vigilant, and thank you for watching.